Is that David Berreby?
It is. Hello, John.
Hi, David. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Welcome to Blogging Heads TV. I'll introduce myself and then let you tell the Blogging Heads audience who you are. I am John Horgan. I'm an occasional correspondent on science for Blogging Heads TV. And with me is...
I'm David Berreby. I'm a science writer like you, John, and I've written for the New Yorker, Smithsonian,
New York Times Magazine,
the Times Science section, lots of places, and I'm also the proud author of this book, Us and Them, The Science of Identity, which is the paperback version of a book I came out with a few years ago.
Yeah, when you asked me if I had your book, you probably meant the paperback version.
Right.
And I don't have that yet. I've got 2 copies of your book in hardcover, so I'm holding up the hardcover version right now. And that's one reason why, you would have been a great guest to talk about anything science-related. I've been a big fan of your work over the years.
Thanks.
But it seems to me that the topics you addressed in Us and Them, which came out 3 years ago originally, are even more relevant today than they were back then. These are sort of timeless issues, but it seems to me that the issues you talk about in your book are particularly to the point right now. So I wonder if you could just tell the audience briefly what your book is about.
Sure. And by the way, I think you're right, which may be the best way for me to describe what it's about, in the sense that when there's an election, when there's some kind of national controversy, the kinds of subjects that the book goes into become part of the general conversation of non-specialists, because politics is in some sense the story of ourselves being told to us by the candidates, by our leaders, or people who want to be our leaders. And they're telling us what we are and what we are about and what it means to be a member of our community. They're proposing these kinds of identities and the kinds of emotions that should be attached to them. And the reason politics works, and the subject of the book, is that we're really, really sensitive to this kind of what marketing people call identity signaling, which is to say, I think without any way to control it, we have an innate sense that what we buy and say and do and like and dislike is not just about itself, about the toothpaste or the movie or whatever it is we're consuming, but also it sends a signal to ourselves and the people around us about where we belong, which side of the various kinds of social divides you place yourself on. And so that's what the book is about. The book came out of my sense that a lot of what we were told about how that works in psychology is wrong, and that there was interesting work going on in social psychology and anthropology and neuroscience that suggested what I thought was the right way to look at it. Can
you tell me?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask. You've got a couple of terms that come up in your book quite a bit. So one is the term kind, and so kind refers to an identity that we assume, and there are obviously different identities that individuals assume. And you've got a term called kind reader.
Yeah.
And you distinguish that from mind reader. I wonder if you could just talk about what you mean by kind reader and mind reader.
Sure. One of the problems in talking about these kinds of questions is that we don't really have a language to talk about it yet. We have these terms that aren't very adequate. Like when we talk about social groups, that's not a great word, because of course all kinds of things we consider groups are in no sense, a coherent group of people. A group you think of as people who are standing together some place, and yet when we speak of social groups, when we talk about soccer moms or Chinese Americans or retirees, and those people are scattered all over the country or all over the world. So that's just, I mean, there are a lot of times when you want to have a language to talk about this subject, and there's kind of not really good words available yet. So the reason I talked about kind reading, kind sight, and humankind is because I was trying to find a way to describe this kind of general capacity, this non-specific capacity we have to get excited about any kind of affiliation with other people. Religion, nation, political party, of course, are very clear to a lot of people, but we also get passionate about our sports teams and our neighborhoods and our cities, and being from New York and not California, or being from Brooklyn, not Manhattan, all that kind of stuff. So in cognitive psychology, of course, there's been lots of work on theory of mind and mind sight, and mind, which is essentially that awareness that most people have without having to learn it. It's one of those automatic things in development. As a child gets a little older, they come to be able to perceive other minds and perceive that a lot of what happens around them is not unrelated sort of accidents or physical forces happening, but instead the result of minds that are different from their own. So, if you ask a very, very young child, you put the famous test is you hide something in a box, and then you say, when someone else will come in, where will they think this is? And then you move it. And autistic people, autistic children, very young children, will think that the person who comes in to the room will predict that the object, a piece of candy or something, is where they know it is. But at a certain age, in development, most kids then are able to realize that they know something, but that another mind is out there, just as real as they are, that doesn't know it. So, anyway, that's theory of mind. And what I am arguing in the book, and it's not original to me. I mean, it's a theory that I think makes a lot of sense in anthropology and cognitive science, is that in the same way that we have for free, without thinking about it, this automatic sense that other people have different are out there, that we can see that from just a little expression on my face or a noise we hear without really being aware of what it is, that we think, oh, that's a person, that's a mind, that's not just random. In that same way, I think we have a built-in sense of kind. We have a built-in propensity to say, okay, those people belong together. And I also think that we also have a propensity to figure out where we are in relation to that. So that's why, I mean, because it rhymes with mind, I thought kind and theory of kind and kind reading would be a way to suggest how to think about this, in the same way. Automatic and sort of uncontrollable in the sense that you can't really not try to classify people, not try to sort of see how people fit together or don't fit together. I just think it's an automatic thing. It's also been called folk sociology, on the analogy with folk physics and folk biology, the idea that before they learn any science or systematic thinking, people learn this kind of sense of how the world works that they get for free. Larry Hirschfeld, an anthropologist at the New School, likes to say that the physics of trajectories of projectiles are really complicated, but everybody knows how to throw a ball.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I don't. I'm sports impaired, but most people, you give them a ball and a little practice, and they can throw it sort of where they want it to land. That's really complicated physics, but they don't need, they just need the folk physics. Like, you do this, that happens, things fall, things weigh more, weigh less. In the same way, there's probably a folk sociology that you get, just a sense of, these people belong together. This is how I understand whether I fit in or not. And of course, on that, we build lots of stuff culturally and with our conscious minds, and it's a really rich part of life. But I think the basis is in some sense innate. And anyway, that's...
Well, isn't it true that, I think you mentioned some ethnography that talks about how many tribes around the world have distinguished between people in the tribe who are considered sort of humanity, who are identified as humans, and then there's everybody who's outside of the tribe who are identified as not us or not human.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I mean that question is often thought of as like, you know, I think the image people have is a bunch of people around a fire and they're all, you know, related like to the second cousin degree, and they go out and they hunt a mammoth every couple of days, and anybody who comes over the hill who isn't a relative, they think, oh, that's bad. And I think it's actually a little more complicated than that, because like in a lot of anthropology on the relations between tribes and clans and so on, what you find is that when someone comes over the hill, they might actually bring some advantages. They might be bringing some trade goods or something you can't have. They might be bringing you information that you don't have. And there's a lot of the relationships between tribes, like in Papua New Guinea, for example, is not sort of we're good and they're bad all the time, automatic hostility. It's more a kind of oscillation between trade, warfare, peace, intermarriage, you know, and there are people who propose that we should sort of study all of that as one thing. But where you start to getting into the really kind of severe mythology that certain people that you see are not really people is in societies where they're not strangers in the sense of being suddenly appearing over the horizon, but they're around. And you need an explanation for why they have these terrible lives, why they're slaves, or why they're serfs, or why they have no opportunity, or why you don't want to have, they can never come to dinner, or you don't call them Mr. Jones, you call them boy. That's where you get the really severe kinds of imagery of dehumanization. It's not sort of in the kind of respectful relations of tribes that are really kind of apart. It's in situations where people are living very close together, and there's a reason why some part of society is not allowed to participate fully in the normal human stuff of exchanges of courtesy and goods and so on. Yeah. And that's where I think you see the most extreme stuff. Is you don't dehumanize your respected enemy who you might have might be related to, in fact, because there are tribes that there are sayings. I think it's from Papua New Guinea where people will say things like, "We marry the people we fight." That's a sort of common traditional relationship, but in a more complicated society where you have slaves and you don't want your children to think that they're in any way to be treated like that, then you need to explain that, well, their ancestors betrayed us, or they're like, they're sick, they have bad diseases that we don't have, or they have horrible customs that we know are immoral. All those things come into play in close quarters, like when people do know each other in a sense, not when they're like total strangers. So.
Hey, I just wanted to get into a specific example of research that you're talking about in your book, and it's an experiment that I thought was fascinating. I first learned about it reading your book, and you devote quite a bit of space to describing it and then discussing its implications. And it's the Robbers Cave experiment by Sharif. Yeah. So I wonder if you could just describe that experiment, its results, and then its implications.
Yeah. That was performed in the summer of 1954, I think. But in the 1950s, it was a social psychologist named Muzaffar Sharif who took a bunch of 10 and 11-year-old boys who were, by our usual sort of, polling measures, alike. They were in the same demographic. They were all white. They all came from the same city. I think it was Oklahoma City. And they were all in the same age. They came from a few different schools. And he put them in a summer camp. And then he all he did was divide them into two groups and give them reasons to think of themselves as rivals. Like, because they were in two groups, that meant instantly they were going to be competing for things in tug of war, baseball, summer camp stuff. But all he did was say, okay, you guys over here, you guys over there. And out of that, the kids invented names for themselves. They became the Rattlers and the Eagles, and they invented these cultures to distinguish themselves from one another. So, for example, one of them was the group that always cursed. They were like the really masculine guys, and they always cursed. And the others were the ones who never cursed. And, the kids were sort of ordered to, or they felt themselves obligated in some profound emotional way to fit in once these cultures had been established. And, we're talking about a matter of days, not centuries or weeks. So the experiment was bring the kids, set them up into these two groups, and see what happens. See if you can't sort of get them to divide, even though they're sort of very much alike. That worked. Then his second phase, which you'd hear less about. I mean, this sometimes is discussed as if it was like the Lord of the Flies in Oklahoma. And, you hear about phases 1 and 2, which end with the kids so violently opposed to each other that they won't eat with each other, and they're like planning to like raid each other's camps at 2 a.m. with rocks, and they have to sort of curtail that part of the experiment because it's looking dangerous. Okay, but that's not the whole story, because what he then engineered was a sort of complete change in these cultures by creating situations where the kids had to work together. I think he faked an accident with a truck and a problem with the food service, and he just sort of created situations where they no longer could indulge themselves. They had to find ways to work together, and they had to see themselves as one group. And that worked just as effectively as the dividing stuff. As quickly as they had become these two groups where one would refuse to eat in the presence of the other, after a few days of seeing themselves as this one bunch of kids with these challenges, they kind of forgot about it. I mean, no, they didn't forget about it. They actually remembered it, and they started joking about it. They'd say, remember when we wouldn't eat together, or remember when we had our own songs, and how they were all singing the Star-Spangled Banner together and stuff. Mm-hmm. So it's a neat illustration of how fast these passions can be sort of stirred up and then attached to things. How quickly like a T-shirt can become like something go from being like, hey, that's cool, to being like, we all have to wear these. You're not wearing this. What's the matter with you? You're a problem. Why aren't you a better member of our side? And also the undoing of that, which is also sort of done by circumstances. So
there was a follow-up experiment done with, I think it was Muslims and
it was
Christian
in Lebanon.
Kids?
It was in Lebanon with slightly older kids, and there again they had they divided into two spontaneously, and they had to cut off the experiment because the divided part was getting really scary with knives and really serious threats, and so they had to stop. But the striking thing to me about that experiment, which really surprised me when I found it, was that the two rival camps in this experiment in Lebanon were both made up of Christian and Muslim kids. In other words, I mean, here's a country with a long, long tradition of religious division. And when you read about the experiment, you think, oh, well, okay, the Christian side went off over here and the Muslims went off over there because, ancient hatreds, clash of civilizations, et cetera, et cetera. It's not what happened. What happened is the two teams were both made up of people from both religions, and for the time that the camp was the world, and that was what they were engaged in, and then they were separated from the Muslim-Christian history of Lebanon briefly, in the sense that they were all sort of just living in this camp. For that time, that the religious stuff receded into the background, and the things that were getting people beat up or threatened was membership in these brand new tribes, the devils and the ghosts, I think they call themselves. So, I mean, that's another illustration of how the passions and the anxiety about this us-them stuff, that's everywhere. But the notion that some particular thing, be it race or religion or nationality, is just inevitable, it's really not true. It's not even true in a particular life. I mean, different circumstances cause people to see different groupings, because we have a lot of different ones available to us all the time, right? So.
David, would it be fair? I thought that one of the themes running through your book was that genes are actually a rather poor predictor of human behavior. So it's sort of antigenetic determinism.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about how these identities that we create for ourselves are really very dynamic and sensitive to circumstance and constructed. And it seems to me that you were sort of implicitly and sometimes explicitly criticizing the view of human nature that we get from, let's say, behavioral genetics or evolutionary psychology, which emphasizes more the these innate genetic determinants of what we do.
Go ahead.
So I wonder, so was that something that you set out to do when you started writing the book, to sort of criticize evolutionary psychology? Let's just talk about evolutionary psychology for starters.
Well, I guess I started on this whole project because I was kind of dissatisfied with what I was hearing. Like people would say. I took a long time to write the book. It was the 90s, which is really, when I started it, a really different time in terms of, the Cold War had recently ended, and so people were still thinking in terms of two of everything. There's the good guys, bad guys, communism and non-communism, black and white. All those, we had this kind of dyads in our, if you grew up in my generation in this country anyway, that's what you had, that you just kind of absorbed that. Even science fiction about, 4 centuries hence was like, the Federation and the Klingons, right? We were really shaped by this idea that there were only, conflicts were simple. It was always two sides. And so, I think what I started with was just this sense of that notion that you can always sort of find whose side everybody's on, and it's predetermined by anything, by culture or by genes or by sort of the death wish, that sort of Freudian notion that we're all like 2 minutes away from wanting to kill each other and become members of this mob. All of these things seem to me not to fit real human behavior, which seem to me about much more flexible kinds of approaches to identity, where people could become passionate and get killed for a football team as well as for a race, and where people could be born in one race and then die in another in terms of their classifications, and where the kind of racial divisions we see in this country that matter a huge amount to people are just not even seen in Brazil. I guess I didn't sort of set out to sort of go after any particular school of thought so much as I thought, there's got to be something better than all these possible alternatives, the Freudian one or the culture Clash of Civilizations one and evolutionary psychology. It's a term that can stand for a lot of stuff, right? I think if it means that we're not blank slates and it's not all just a creation of discourse, then I think they're onto something. I think it's pretty clear that there's things that people can't do anything about in their own in the makeup of their own minds, and but on the other hand, evolutionary psychology, when I started the book, also stood for these kinds of extremely reductive explanations that said, if you, I remember somebody actually proposing to me that, once you understand what chimpanzees do, we're so close to them genetically, we're done. And we don't really act like chimpanzees. Certainly not in this area, because, if you ever get anywhere near a chimpanzee, you learn they really don't like anybody they don't already know. They're really kind of hyper xenophobic, and that's not what people are like. It's just not. So yeah, I think that trying to explain how people can want to be religious martyrs, for example, would prefer to die rather than to change what they say they believe. I don't think you're going to get very far by saying, that there's a genetic basis for that. Unless, in a very general way, you want to say that we have, genes that create this really complicated mind that can have a notion of membership in this abstract thing that is so important that they're willing to. But then, I think there's a point where you just have to sort of open it up to other levels of analysis, And I think the great problem with some of the genetic explanations, anyway, is that they try to explain something that's really not a genetic concept at all with genes.
Can you? What about? So there's a lot of debate over whether race is even a legitimate category, sort of natural category, something that science can define and study. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the best way to understand that is to realize that if you're doing looking into haplotypes and trying to find population groups to sort out human ancestry, that's not where your ideas about race come from. You're not doing DNA analysis and then sorting things out. You're starting with the idea that there are in this country that there are black people and white people and Asians, and then you're going and looking for genes. And so, in a sense, you will find them. Of course, you'll find them. But that doesn't mean that they justify where your starting point, because your starting point is in culture and is in history. For example, Ashkenazi Jews are at higher risk for having bearing children with Tay-Sachs disease. Okay, that is a connection between the cultural and historical concept of being Jewish and a biological fact. But Louisiana Cajuns are also a group because of a genetic founder effect. They're also a group that is susceptible or has higher rates of risk for Tay-Sachs disease. So that doesn't make them Jewish. In other words, there's, there was this sort of argument that I think is dying out now, which I think is great when I started in the 90s, there was a sense that either you thought it could all be reduced to genes. Genes determine whether you like to take risks and whether you're going to get a divorce and whether you have intelligence or something. That was the behavioral part, and then the haplotypes tell you whether you are really European or really African. That was sort of that's genes. Or you have to be on the other extreme and say it's all discourse and race is a fiction, and if you're a black guy trying to get a cab in Manhattan, the race is not fictional at all. And so, the idea that we could just sort of analyze our way out of it because it's all culture, or that we could just kind of confirm these beliefs we were told on TV by genes, and those are two extremes, sort of, hyper-reductionism and I think what you like to call POMO or postmodernism. And I think, the answers are not going to be at either extreme, because the fact is there is something real going on about race, in the sense that if you have a 500-year history of being obsessed with it as Americans are, then you can't say, I'm just going to give you an analysis and then you're free. There are a whole bunch of things that it doesn't matter whether we understand, and I think that's kind of the big message of psychology in the last couple of decades is it doesn't matter what you want to believe or want to do about all kinds of things that you do. It still happens. It still will your behavior will still, for example, a really good example of this is something called the implicit association test, which is, you give people a chance to associate words with a concept or an image, or a photo or something. It's a test that sort of shows how quickly with a computer, you can do it online, in fact, how quickly with a computer you will associate sort of positive words with names, for example, or with concepts or with photos. And it disturbs some people to take this test because their conscious minds are completely, again, they give the test to somebody who's like a Harvard undergraduate or something, and of course they're sort of politically correct and they think they're completely free of all prejudices. But on the test, it turns out they associate positive words more quickly with white names, for example, than with black names. You can't, that's not under your conscious control. So, and I think there's a lot of that in psychology. I think it would be good to start thinking about what do we do now that we know that we don't know what we're doing. There's plenty of evidence for that from behavioral economics too, as you probably know.
Well, so what would be, I don't know, what can be taken away from this research that would actually make us more enlightened and behave better toward each other? It seems to me that, a couple of things. First of all, that this research can be used to, it's in some ways it's sort of depressing because it shows how easily we can be manipulated. So the Robbers Cave experiment, on the one hand, it's great that the boys all came together at the end and worked on solving these problems as one and transcended the differences that they had before. On the other hand, the fact that they had divided so quickly, and somewhat spontaneously in the beginning, and had become so nasty toward each other over completely superficial, illusory even differences. That's quite disturbing. So that's sort of one conclusion that I've drawn from this research that makes me not feel so great about it. The other is that this research, I would think, can be used both for sort of positive social engineering and negative social engineering. So, you can imagine it being used to help people become more aware of the arbitrary nature of some of our identities and how the differences that we perceive between us and some others are really arbitrary and superficial. On the other hand, you can imagine evil political operatives taking this research and using it to divide people in ways that favor their candidate or system of government even more effectively.
Well, I think that I actually thought about writing a kind of perfect example of all of the ways that you could demonize somebody or some group of people, and then I thought, gee, it just creeped me out to even try, because it didn't really.
Well, Karl Rove has already perfected that art. I'm not.
That's the thing is that, I would actually an acquaintance of mine said that he had run into Karl Rove at a conference, and he was carrying a copy of my book, and he said, so I gave it to Karl Rove. And I thought, oh man, I'd love to know what happened. I had this moment of thinking, what if he says, hey, that was a really good idea on page 208, and we want to try it. But I think that actually, it's like the thing about what people say when the argument against free speech, after 9/11 is don't talk about how unsafe our ports are because the terrorists will take advantage of this, or if you point out that how easy it is to get into rail yards. I don't even want to do it here, but what I'm saying is the counter argument when people start saying we shouldn't talk about our vulnerabilities or problems that are terrorism related is that the counter argument is that they've already thought of it. If you could talk about it on
Right.
talk about how to make a bomb out of drugstore stuff on CNN, well, they've probably already gotten that. They've probably thought it through. So I would say something analogous to that. I would say that if people are doing research on how susceptible other people are to manipulation, people have been perfecting these techniques probably, since throughout recorded history.
Right.
When Sarah Palin says palling around with terrorists, that there are so many cultures with castes of serfs or slaves or outcast people that say things like, they helped the Mongols invade Korea in the 13th century, so that's why we don't treat them like other Koreans. Or, when Charlemagne came to Spain to fight Islam, these people fought for Islam and converted, so that's why we have the right to make them work on our haciendas in medieval Spain. None of this stuff is new, so I don't really know that
Right.
it's gonna. I agree with you. I think anything to do with these kinds of passions is, it can make people stop and say, gee, I take my religion seriously, and am I being a good enough adherent to my religion? Or am I being a good enough citizen? It can make people do good stuff, in the robber's cave, there was a kid who was really a chicken. He wouldn't jump into the stream to swim, and he overcame his kind of chickenness, his geekness, by his fear of just kind of getting up there and jumping off the rock, not because of any kind of pep talk or we're all special in our own special way, blah 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 stuff. He felt like he had to not let down the rest of the group. So this is not, inherently bad, but it's also, as you say, not inherently good. And so I guess actually, there's another really important point about this research, though. If you want to, I'll just put it this way: if you have a situation in which we learn more and more that people can be manipulated in all kinds of ways, what they call priming effects in psychology. There was a study in PNAS in the summer where they found that people, if they vote in a school, are more likely to vote for money for education than if they're voting in a firehouse.
Right, it's the old subliminal cueing effect, which was supposed to have been disproven in advertising, and it's been overwhelmingly confirmed.
Exactly,
by
it's
some
like
experiments.
or you tell people, you remind people of stereotypes of the elderly, and then the people you've mentioned that to will go shuffling more slowly down the hall than if they had been reminded of other stereotypes. So, there's a lot of susceptibility here. But the reason I brought that up is because I think when you do research on it and find that there are measurable statistical effects, and you can say this really happens, and here's how it works. That helps people simply because it makes, if we're all getting manipulated all the time, or people are trying to manipulate us, then the only way to sort of deal with that is to be aware. That's where you can be democratic about it. You can't. Not everybody has access to Fox News or big website or something or an advertising budget. But everybody can sort of learn about their own mind and how it works, and so that when they see the manipulation coming, they can, because of this research, they can sort of be a little more aware. I actually think that's already happening. I think that's, people talk about inside baseball and spin rooms and cynicism and how everybody talking about this election sounds like they're a political consultant, We're no longer talking about the issues. We're talking about image and, strategy. I think that's kind of the media trying to even out the playing field. It's like precisely because these techniques are so strong for manipulating people, it's like that's kind of a democratic function of the media, I think, to sort of to say, well, okay, this manipulation is coming at you 24/7, so you can't turn it off, and you can't become a robot who's not responsive to it. So we'll at least tell you what's going on. We'll tell you how it works. We'll tell you what they're trying to do, so that I think that's good to try to level the playing field in that sense.
To at least make us more
Right.
aware of how we're being manipulated. Let me just, since you brought up the election, are you hopeful does the popularity of Obama? I mean, it really looks like he's pulling away from McCain now. So we're taping this on the day after the third debate between Obama and McCain, and according to the polls that I just saw this morning, a majority of people thought Obama won the debate, which makes me feel good because I thought he completely kicked McCain's ass, in spite of McCain saying, threatening beforehand that he would do that to Obama. And it seems to me that the McCain camp has obviously tried to use identity politics to gain an advantage over Obama. He looks funny. He's, this kind of hybrid person, not really American, not really black or white, and sort of an elitist, but not really an elitist. So they've just tried to make him this sort of exotic person, and it hasn't worked so far. So does that? I mean, does this? Can we assume that, or is it putting too positive a spin on this to say that this shows that people are becoming more sophisticated in their judgment of leaders and what qualities they look for, and are transcending some of these traditional categories of black or white or male or female, or this our religion or some other religion, and that we're evolving toward a more enlightened, peaceful, and harmonious future?
Wow, John, you're in a good mood this morning.
Well, that might have been sarcastic, but no, it wasn't. It was actually sincere.
I mean, I was really fascinated by some of the things, as I mentioned. I mean, to me, having tried to find sort of historical examples of these kinds of stigmas and propaganda techniques, I'm just thinking, wow, these are so familiar. They come up so many times before in other places, and I was fascinated to see them come up and not work. They're also. I was intrigued by the. a lot. As I said, a lot of this is not the facts about anybody, but the way in which they're framed, the way in which they're sort of interpreted, and there's always a lot of possible interpretations. So I think that their campaign was very good at getting down to these very basic us-them kinds of things that get people excited. I mean, when they talk about Obama's exotic life, for example, David Broder said Obama should explain his exotic life better, and I thought, well, here's John McCain. He's born in Panama. He's, his life is flying jets and dropping bombs and being in a prison camp, and then being a famous politician. But it's Obama who's had the exotic life. I mean, that's that's an example of getting there first. I think, in the sense of if you want to do this kind of stuff, you need to sort of paint the picture before the other picture can be suggested. But I do think it's really interesting that it didn't work. I think that's a really important thing to think about, and because I think you talk about pessimism. You want to be clear about what it is that you think is going on in psychology, and you say this is if you sort of associate a person or a group of people with death, that people will see them as not to be touched, and it sounds as if in some way you're being fatalistic, like you're saying, once this technique is used, then terrible, this horrible downward spiral of abuse will happen and so on. But it is really interesting that it doesn't always work, and that it can be undone. I mean, that's the other lesson of Robert's Cave, which is paralleled, I think, in the history of a number of nations, including our own. You can undo this kind of beliefs. In fact, there's a study recently I just was looking at that. There's plenty of evidence now that a lot of white people are very anxious about not appearing racist, and that this has effects on their thinking processes and behaviors. If there's body of work that shows that, if you give people a kind of a simple task to do after a conversation about a neutral subject with a black person, they're white, they're talking to a black person, they will not do as well on that test as the control group of white people who talk to a white person. And the thinking is that that's because they're spending a lot of gas, a lot of cognitive fuel on am I doing this right? Am I coming across in the right way? I don't want to look racist. And even 10 and 11-year-old kids will do worse on a little test that in order to avoid mentioning who's black and who's white in the photographs that they have to play with. So here we have this country that sort of was officially culturally white supremacist not that long ago in living memory, right? And now we have millions of people in the white American group who are anxious about not looking prejudiced, even if they are. I mean, that's things can change really fast. But I don't know. I'm not big on progress. I mean, I think. I mean, I like progress, but what I mean is I don't think there's anything inevitable about stages of these kinds of things. I mean, I found stuff when I was doing research on Yugoslavia, written in the 70s, saying, all this, ethnic and religious stuff is behind us. Yugoslavia resembles the United States in its wonderful pluralistic peacefulness. And then, we saw what happened, right? So, I mean, I think any situation that involves these kind of passions about deeply held identities can go either way, always. It can always get better, and it can always get worse. And I don't really think there's a kind of a ladder of upward or downward progress.
Oh, that's depressing. I think...
Well, the really important point I want to make, though, is I don't think that it's like a mystic or economic or geopolitical or genetic cycles that are going on here. I do think what politicians do really matters, because as I was saying before, I think that politics is basically the stuff is taking these images and these emotions and doing something with them. It's sort of the raw material out of which politicians work. And I think if a politician gives people alternative ways of seeing themselves, then that sort of creates different ways of interpreting these us-them divides. And I think that's what successful politicians do. And that's why I think the McCain campaign it's fair to blame them and hold them responsible. Not because there's lunatics who shout out crazy stuff, but because they created a set of images. They made available a set of images to voters that suggested that this is how they should see themselves. Like if you're not a red state person, then you're not a proper American. Obama did the opposite, and I think there's a great tradition of that. And I think I just want to read you really quickly the best example of that, which is Bobby Kennedy announcing to a crowd of people in Indiana that Martin Luther King has just been shot. And they didn't know it. You can hear them going, and he says, "For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and distrust at the injustice of such an act against all white people, I can only say that I feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man." So, and then he goes on to say, we have to make an effort to all be Americans together in this. And that worked. That was a crowd that could easily have gone into a world of there's blacks and there's whites, there's us and there's them. And he said something else. And that made a difference. And I think, so I don't think there's anything inevitable. I don't think it's about education or good scientific theories or something. But I do think that leaders who give people a way of seeing themselves more broadly, give them alternatives, as opposed to trying to get rid of alternative ways of seeing their identity, that can lead to people to see a bigger version of what us means. And I think that's what Obama's done. So I think it's really it's about these actual politicians. I don't think it's about sort of broad trend.
I mean, I think you could, if we didn't have this economic collapse recently, then I think some of the identity politics of the Republicans would have been more effective. It's just that now the obvious intelligence of Obama, his competence in managing his campaign, his ability to express himself extremely clearly, even when he's talking about very complex topics, his calmness under pressure, whether he's debating Hillary Clinton or John McCain. I think these categories are what impress people because of these dire circumstances that we find ourselves in. So this just confirms one of the themes of your book, that the way that we judge people and whether we sort of like them and trust them or distrust and dislike them has a lot to do with circumstances, which obviously can change very dramatically when you're talking about politics. Just in terms of progress, what about the idea that globalization and communications and the internet, travel, all these ways that we are connected with other people around the globe, that these are dissolving some of the traditional barriers that have divided people, and that are making us identify with larger and larger numbers of people, and even with all of humanity, this sort of thing. Do you find that at all persuasive?
I don't, actually, and I think for two reasons. One is that it's really hard to identify with all of humanity. There's a lot of people. They're really far away. A lot of the things that are really convincing are in particular. They're connected to language and food and the flag over your head and the light on the particular trees in your village, and you can get people to feel that way in a fairly intensely. I mean, the world religions have been enormously successful at that, right? But again, I mean, the world religions can make someone be friendly to a Christian they've never met before, and not friendly to their neighbor they've known all their lives, because they want to be better to a fellow Christian than to a heathen. But even that's not like universal, because that's it's like it's only for Christians on the other side of the world that you have this fellow feeling. That actually, I just realized, is probably a calumny against Christianity. I probably shouldn't have said that, because I think the ideal is universal love. But still, I mean, there's some evidence on my behalf, right? Anyway. I think people tend to get more passionate about stuff that's a little more local than all humanity, and the internet lets you connect with other people to form these kinds of groups, and I think that's much more typical of the informational part of globalization. It's not, wow, we're all alike, let's all make peace now, but more like, oh, now I have email and text messages and a website, so I can be in touch with other people who want to bomb the state capitol, or denounce evolutionary theory or something. I mean, it really helps people who want to form identity groups to find other people like them. So in that sense, it sort of helps people break down away from this world community thing, especially since it also lets you tailor what you learn about and who you see. Like you are on the internet picking and choosing your sources of news and whose email you take out of the spam folder and all that, right? And I think that also sort of lends itself to kind of walling yourself off more readily than before this technology existed. And I think the other thing is about globalization is it makes people really nervous and unhappy to see all this change, and that can drive people in their anxiety to assert that some mythical past that never really existed is where we should go to. Tom DeZingotito, who's a really interesting media studies guy, points out that fundamentalism is really modern. Fundamentalists are not people who adhere strictly and simply to their religion, because if they did that, they would just do it. They're people who have decided to advocate their religion in the face of a threat or in the face of a period where they were not religious. And so, that's important to remember. I mean, that globalization can make a lot of people feel like they're losing the identity that they care about. And that doesn't make them go, oh, that's terrific. That can make them feel very bad. But I think another point you made is really important, which is that, or implied, is that economics, you said that we're in an economic crisis. I think a lot of people would expect that to make things worse in terms of these kinds of hatreds and group antagonism. And that's not what happens. It's prosperous people who are always the worst and most fierce advocates of these kinds of tactics. It's prosperity that does it. That's weird. I don't understand that.
Do you know a philosopher named John Gray?
Yeah.
British philosopher. He wrote a book called Straw Dogs that came out, I think, 5 years ago, and followed up with a book called Black Mass that I think came out just last year. Both of them have basically the same theme, which is that in the past we were dominated by these great religious ideologies, and then with the Enlightenment there was this hope that we could transcend these superstitious ways of approaching reality, and would have a rational system of governance based on creating the greatest good for the greatest number and so forth. Gray argues that secular humanism, this kind of philosophy that arose from the Enlightenment, is actually just repackaged Christianity, which had a very naive faith in some kind of, in progress and in some kind of perfect city, golden city on a hill at the end of time, and that now that has collapsed. He actually thinks that the war in Iraq is sort of the signal of the end time for liberal democracy, and this idea that all of humanity would come together and accept this rational best system for governing ourselves, and that now we're descending into resource wars and wars of faith. So it's going to be hellish from here on in.
I think I reviewed his last book. Maybe I think it came out last year, and he's you thought I was pessimistic. I mean, he's really like he I think basically is saying that any notion that any set of beliefs or principles is superior to any other is really not sustainable, and we're living by these kind of ridiculous myths of progress. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression and my memory is that he's basically saying, our sort of architecture of human rights and progress and democracy is just our belief system that happens to have triumphed for the moment because we've got more weapons, and our time will pass and some other bunch of beliefs that are equally arbitrary will dominate, and that's life. And
it is something like that. He's just saying that we're hopelessly irrational, and that progress. Well, it's very similar to what you just said, that there's nothing inevitable about progress. Is that you can have what seems to be progress for a while, but it's not like there's this idea of the ratchet of progress that once you take a step forward, this is certainly true of science to some extent and technology, that each advance is irreversible, and so you can only have progress. You can't go backwards. But Gray says in politics that is certainly not the case.
I think Hitler put paid to that. When you see all of the technology of the 20th century, all these advances being used in this completely insane genocide that they even when they were losing the war in Germany, they diverted resources to make sure they could keep killing Jews, and trains, railroads, chemicals, all these kind of 20th century technologies that supposedly made barbarism inconceivable. I think.
But he was defeated. He was defeated, and now
Right.
that sort of racist ideology has been. I mean, it hasn't been completely wiped out, but it's been marginalized. I think there's, even in the 20th century, I think there is some progress. I think the actions of the Bush administration in using violence to force democracy down the throat of another nation
Right.
was, it's the step backward before two steps forward. So I'm hopelessly and I'm sure irrationally optimistic. Let me just, we're sort of running out of time. How about
Okay.
the idea, which I think is one of the lessons that can be drawn from Robber's Cave, that if we have a problem, if we have a sort of common problem, that can help us overcome our differences. I think this is part of what explains the popularity of Obama now, that he's seen as somebody who can. I mean, we're all enmeshed in these economic problems now, and he's seen
Right.
as somebody who can help pull us out of these. But we also, around the world, are facing serious environmental problems that transcend national borders and ethnic divisions and so forth. So what about that sort of old idea that if we have these common challenges, that will pull us together?
Yeah, that absolutely. Shared goals. That's what Sharif called them, shared obstacles. That's certainly that's bound to work. I mean, I guess all I would say about that is that unlike in a summer camp where the challenge is getting the truck that's stuck in the mud to get going again, in politics it's not a matter of what's really confronting us, but how it's presented. That's why I think what politicians do is they make available certain ideas about who we are and where we belong, and I think some of those are definitely better than others. But I don't think that you can escape the moment where you draw the border. I mean, for example, I thought Obama on abortion was brilliant, because I mean there's something where for as long as I've been an adult, the idea was put up your flag and throw brickbats at the other side, and he was trying to turn it into something where we could find common ground, even on that one. And that's where he was saying nobody likes abortion, but we have different ideas about what to do about it, but let's see what we can agree on. That's a perfect example of what you're talking about. But he also said in one of these debates that we should stop borrowing billions from China and sending it to Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Which, so there's he's saying we're all in this together, all of us Americans.
Right.
So that means there's people who aren't in it with us. And there is that's
sort of required for a major American politician.
Right. And I think it's required for anybody. I don't think you can, there's always a line. As I mentioned in the book, John Milton, who wrote all these pamphlets in favor of tolerance for all kinds of Protestants, when he got to, Stanley Fish says, when he got to Catholics, he said, oh, well, no, not Catholics, them we burned. There's always a point where you say, no, that's too far, and that's, but politicians are kind of artists of this, and they can do it so that people feel safer and bigger and warmer about themselves and about the future, or they can do it in such a way that they just want to go out and get an AK-47, and that's their responsibility. And I agree with you that Obama's been very good at that. I also want to just say I don't agree with John Gray. I did not like that book at all.
Oh, okay.
I don't think that we're just randomly imposing ourselves, or that, I think, well, maybe we are, but I think it's better. I do think some ideologies are better than others in some measurable way. Mm-hmm. And I certainly don't think we ought to just go, well, let's just give up and wait.
I don't think Gray was, he's not a total relativist. I think what he's objecting to, I'm pretty sure that he's a secular humanist himself. It's just that he was saying that it's delusional to believe that that secular humanism is so obviously
Right.
superior to all other ideologies that it will sweep the world, and we will all be living under this one sort of way of organizing ourselves and
Right.
seeing the world.
Right. Right. I think, yeah, and I think that's, I think his problem is that he says he has a way of judging the inadequacy of these Enlightenment values. But then the way he judges them is with Enlightenment values. I mean, if this is just not universally applicable, and just happens to be a historical accident that it's dominant for the moment, and the whole basis of the book is to say what's wrong with this ideology and others, and that needs like a sense of a standard. You need a ruler to measure it by, and at the same time, so he's saying this ruler is no good, really. It's not. It's really not the universal measure you think it is, and yet the way he knows that is by using the ruler.
Well, I think it's more sort of judging ideologies by their fruits. So what his objection to really is fanaticism of any kind. So he points out that secular intellectuals like Richard Dawkins harp on the evil that has been done in the name of religion, but then of course on the flip side there is the evil of the French Revolution, and the evil that was done in the name of social Darwinism or Marxism or eugenics as practiced by the Nazis. So
eugenics was advanced scientific opinion in the 1920s. I mean, if you were the equivalent of Richard Dawkins in the 1920s, or the equivalent of you or me, you were at the leading edge of enlightened thought. George Bernard Shaw and et cetera was eugenics was a good thing.
Well, absolutely.
It's the anti-science people who said this is immoral.
I think he's just sort of arguing for, and I certainly would agree with this, for more modesty when it comes to trying to impose our values on other people, whether they're secular or religious values.
Right.
And he's all he has to do is look at history to show how it's sort of, as I said, fanaticism of any kind, even when it seems to be in support of Enlightenment ideas, scientific ideals, that gets us into trouble. I think it seems to be the kind of thing that he seems to have been influenced by Isaiah Berlin, who said pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree that the problem is not the content of people's beliefs. I mean, I think you can have, in the name of anything. I mean, that's kind of one of the central points of my book. Really, is that the content of the beliefs, if it's a religion or an ideology or just the Red Sox, whatever. That's not good or bad. That's not going to be the explanation for why some people can get so caught up in their adherence that they will kill somebody on the subway, or that they'll burn down a guy's house, or they won't let a whole class of people vote because they're not in the same category. It's not about the beliefs. It's something else. It's like, and I think that's what we need to understand better is how to get people to give themselves permission not to get into this state of extreme fear.
Why can't we all just get along, David?
Well, I think a good way to kind of coda for all this is something Clifford Geertz told me once. He said, other people are as real as you are. And I think that's what you're talking about here.
Except for Sarah Palin.
No, even Sarah Palin, she seems pretty real. I mean, I don't, she creeps me out, but that's a perfect example. It's like I have this visceral reaction to her and everything that she all the groups that she's appealing to give me, like, I think, and I know that that's not, I don't mistake that for policy positions. I don't think that my dislike of Sarah Palin is based on what, her stance on offshore drilling. I know that it's an irrational thing that I have, and that if I was ever to meet her or debate somebody who was like her biggest fan, I would be watching for that.
Well, how come we liberals have to be tolerant all the time? It just seems like, can't we be intolerant and hateful now and then? I think so.
I think that we are. I think I don't.
But we feel
see
bad
any
about
lack
it.
of
We feel
what?
bad about it. We have to feel guilty about it. I think
maybe because we don't go to church.
I think just for the rest of this election cycle, I am going to be filled with hate and loathing and a sense of superiority to people who would vote for McCain and Palin, and I'm not going to feel bad about it.
Well,
But then I'll go back to my liberal values after Obama wins.
So, in other words, you're turning into Sidney Blumenthal, right? You say, like, elections are not about nonpartisanship; they're about the fulfillment of partisanship. Like, to the victor go the spoils. Well, that's fine. I admit I have those moments. There's a part of me that, like, when I see the people at the McCain-Palin rallies, I think, it's not your country. It's mine. I don't think we're all in this together. I think you are no longer going to be running the show, and that's fine with me. But I mean, one of the things I like about Obama is he's a lot more mature than I am, and that, he won't be doing that with them. And that's good, because he's trying to, like, have everybody,
Hey, David, we're at an hour and 11 minutes, so I think
that's it, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that was really fun.
That was great, John. Thank you.
And so go Obama, and he is going to lead us to the promised land.
That's great.